If the wise man accepts that all events are necessary, then where does freedom reside? This was Zeno's ultimate question, one that struck at the very root of Cassius' youthful certainty. For years, Cassius had built his understanding upon the grand pillar of free will, the belief that human choices carve out their own destiny, unconstrained by external necessity or cosmic design. But now, standing in the warm hush of the atrium, those foundations seemed to tremble, threatened by the subtle, persistent logic of determinism. He had arrived at a conclusion seemingly solid as marble, that every action, every word was the singular result of prior causes. He saw the river not as a path negotiable by will, but as a predetermined flow, unstoppable and perfect in its trajectory. Yet, to simply surrender his belief felt like a betrayal, a yielding to fatalism rather than genuine philosophy. The mentor, Zeno, did not argue with Cassius' theory. Instead, he performed a far more difficult task, guiding him through paradox. He asked about the choice between two routes in a marketplace, yet insisted that even the momentary twitch of his finger as he gestured was itself determined by the muscle tension established moments before. Every hesitation, every passing glance, all were merely nodes in an inescapable chain reaction. Cassius felt a profound discomfort. His internal struggle was no longer about proving himself right. It was about reconciling what he felt to be true with what Zeno's relentless questioning made him suspect of being false. He began to see choice not as an active creation, but as an inevitable recognition, a mere unfolding of necessity. Later, the pressure increased in the bustling heart of the Agora. The market was a symphony of chaotic life, merchants shouting prices, children playing with stolen coins, the scent of spices mingling with human sweat and dust. Cassius walked through it, expecting to feel the exhilarating brushstrokes of personal autonomy against his skin. Instead, he felt something else, a subtle weight, an illusion of motion. He realized that even the momentum pushing him past a stall of brightly colored pottery was connected by invisible threads back to his breakfast, to the conversation he had with Zeno hours earlier. The discomfort sharpened when he overheard two strangers debating destiny. They spoke in hushed, fervent tones about fate and human effort, their words seeming to echo the very paradox that tormented Cassius internally. He found himself detached, an observer watching a play already written. His mind raced back through his own recent memories, the casual slight, the impulsive jest, the words spoken in sudden heat, and he tried to locate the genuine point of choice within them. Where did he step in? Was there a moment where causality stopped and he could simply begin anew? The memory flashed back, sharp and searing, an argument with one he loved. The words had been spat out in an emotional surge, a sudden, regrettable act of uncontrolled impulse that left scars on another's spirit. He remembered the heat, the flush of anger, the certainty in his own voice. In the past, this moment felt like pure agency, a testament to his unbridled will against circumstance. Now, viewed through the lens of necessity, it felt different. It felt less like a choice and more like the logical climax of accumulated frustration and unmet expectations. The realization was deeply unsettling. That spontaneous outburst had been written into the sequence. The anger itself was determined. The sharp words were merely its necessary outcome. He could not break the cycle, only observe it in its painful completion. As days passed, his search for personal freedom led him to the riverside, a place of quiet contemplation and constant motion. Here, he found himself watching logs drift downstream, carried by the steady, indifferent flow of the current. He tried to imagine stopping them, to wrestle them back toward the bank against the pull of the water. The effort was immense, draining, pointless. They simply obeyed physics. They moved where necessity guided them. The quiet wisdom arrived not with a thunderclap or a dramatic epiphany, but like a gentle tide receding into calm acceptance. Fighting the current did not save him from its force, it only exhausted him. True freedom, he began to understand, was not found in altering the path of the river, but in acknowledging and flowing with its existing rhythm. Resistance is suffering. Assent is serenity. Zeno then turned this contemplation into a game of pure logic. He challenged Cassius to predict a complex sequence involving several other people, a minor interaction at the forum, say, where three men were meeting to trade goods. Cassius attempted it with meticulous focus. He predicted the first man would offer too much, that the second man would be skeptical, and that a third action would prompt a negotiation shift. The more points he plotted, the less novelty remained in his own mind. He saw that every proposed outcome was simply derived from predictable human motivations and historical patterns. True randomness, true uncaused choice, it seemed to vanish under the weight of reasoned analysis. The ultimate frontier of control, Zeno suggested, was not over external events or even one's immediate reactions, but over a singular internal process. The breath. He had Cassius focus solely on the act of breathing in and out at that precise moment. There were no variables to predict, no motivations to account for. It was simply an occurrence, natural, cyclical, necessary. This taught him a profound shift. If he could not control what happened, or even how others reacted, he could perhaps anchor himself only to the internal present, the momentary act of breathing itself. That moment was the last bastion of self-possession. The intellectual exploration gradually narrowed until it focused intensely on judgment. Zeno argued that while our actions are indeed linked by cause and effect, our moral response to those events, our assent or refusal of judgment, that faculty remains uniquely ours. The event may be fated, but the virtue with which we process it, the character we choose in response, is the last freedom remaining. If tragedy struck a loved one, the death was perhaps inevitable according to cosmic law. But the despair that followed, the bitterness directed at fate, or the choice to honor memory through generosity, these were choices of judgment. He could not control the external sorrow, but he held sovereignty over his inner narrative. This became the central paradox, absolute determinism forcing an absolute responsibility onto the internal landscape of the self. Cassius began to move differently through life. He no longer expected magic exceptions to fate. He understood that power lay in mastering the small space between stimulus and response. The world remained a river of necessity, but he found his own raft within himself, stable, self-governing, accepting the current while guiding its passage through his mind's steady virtue. This was not resignation. It was highly refined empowerment. It was the freedom to be perfectly human in an unfree cosmos. Every movement we make feels like a decision, a choice that springs from our very core, a moment where I will confront the inevitable flow of time. We believe in this sense of self-determination, this sacred spark within us. But what if the map we carry inside our minds is flawed? What if the feeling of choosing is merely an elaborate illusion, a beautiful and necessary misinterpretation of cause and effect? The Stoic path demands that we dismantle these cherished certainties piece by piece. We must look at our simplest acts, the lifting of a hand, the turning toward a friend, even the simple act of breathing in and out. Are these actions truly spontaneous? Or are they the necessary culmination of a long chain, a reaction to moments before, which were themselves reactions to even earlier things? This is the uncomfortable weight of looking back and seeing only connections. Consider an imaginary marketplace, bustling with life and potential choices. You stand at a crossroads of thought, faced with two paths, A or B. Your internal mind screams freedom. It insists that you are unbound, capable of selecting either way purely by your will. But the philosophy whispers caution. It demands that we examine the sequence leading up to this very moment. What led you to this exact spot? Did the crowd's noise draw your eye left? Was it the scent of roasted grain that pulled you right? Perhaps the state of your stomach, a physical necessity, influenced your stride before your conscious mind even registered the urge for direction. The deeper we delve into the structure of reality, the more visible the intricate architecture of necessity becomes. Our perceived free will begins to unravel like thread pulled from an old tapestry. It is not that we do nothing. Rather, we are woven entirely within a pattern already set by the laws of nature and preceding events. Every twitch, every glance, every careful step in the marketplace is merely the inevitable outcome of everything that transpired just before it. This realization does not lead to apathy, nor does it mean resigning ourselves to inaction. Quite the opposite. Accepting the necessity of external events frees us to focus with brutal clarity on the one place where genuine power resides: our judgment. If our actions are governed by an unbreakable chain of cause and effect, then what remains truly ours? Our reaction, our assent, the internal choice. The bustling marketplace of the Agora was a symphony of relentless life. Voices rose and fell in arguments about trade and fate. Scents of ripe fruit mingled with the dust kicked up by passing sandals. To Cassius, however, this vibrant chaos was not merely life. It felt like an elaborate, unfolding performance. He walked among the crowds, yet he did not feel free. Every glance that met his own in a stranger's eye seemed calculated. Every slight delay of a chariot wheel, every unexpected laugh, they struck him with the undeniable certainty of necessity. He carried within him the weight of difficult knowledge, lessons gleaned from paradoxical debates and whispered reflections by quiet rivers. He knew the mechanisms of cause and effect. A conversation spoken at sunrise was merely the echo of events that unfolded long before Cassius had drawn his first breath. His initial belief in a spontaneous will seem to have dissolved under the relentless pressure of time and causality. Yet, walking this path, immersed in the immediacy of human interaction, the knowledge remained intellectually rigorous but emotionally jarring. He felt himself suspended, a mind that understood destiny's blueprint, navigating a life screaming for the illusion of choice. He observed men haggling over the price of olives, their negotiations seemingly free and passionate. Were they truly choosing? Or was their passion itself determined by their history, their needs, and the weight of cultural expectation? A profound discomfort settled in his chest. He paused near a fountain where two strangers were engaged in a heated debate. One argued passionately for human agency, insisting that every word spoken was born from an independent, sovereign self. The other countered with quiet certainty, citing the unbroken chain linking every cause to its effect. Cassius listened, not as an objective academic, but as a man whose soul was vibrating with doubt. If his friend's choice of words was merely the necessary outcome of that stranger's genetic predisposition and their schooling, where did his own power reside? The boundaries between determinism and freedom blurred into a single, terrifying continuum. The whispers of destiny became overwhelming in the Agora. They were not grand pronouncements from the gods, but subtle currents. The way a group paused to admire an awning, the trajectory of a falling basket of figs. These small moments screamed necessity. Cassius felt himself becoming less like a participant and more like a carefully placed actor reading lines in a script written by unseen hands. The intellectual detachment he had cultivated was failing against the primal demand for autonomy that fueled human existence. He found himself stumbling internally, caught between the comforting mythology of free will and the cold logic of causation. It was an agonizing predicament. If nothing he did, thought, or felt was truly his own invention, then what meaning remained in striving? What weight did ambition hold if the path to it was already laid out? This realization was not merely a philosophical problem. It was a personal earthquake. He watched a child chasing pigeons through the crowd. The chase seemed joyful, random, unconstrained. Yet even the physics of the flight, the initial push off the ground, the necessary arc in the air, was bound by laws that held nothing sacred enough to defy them. He saw determinism writ small on every single surface. The flow of people, the predictable rise and fall of voices, the eternal rhythm of market commerce. It was a beautiful, inescapable cage. The inner discomfort grew exponentially, manifesting as a kind of physical anxiety. His mind screamed for confirmation of choice. His growing understanding insisted upon absolute necessity. He felt trapped in the glorious contradiction of being an advanced intellect, whose highest-level knowledge threatened to dismantle the fundamental reality of his emotional life. To accept fate was to surrender the very drama that made existence feel worth living, the potential for genuine, uncaused rebellion. The memories arrived not as faint echoes, but with the sharp, unbearable clarity of a fresh cut. Cassius found himself back at the moment he had always sought to dissect and control, the words that had been spoken in the heat of anger. He saw the flush creeping up his neck, the sudden, irrational surge of defensive fury, the way his throat tightened with ill-considered accusation. It was a vivid, painful flashback, one that made him recoil from the illusion of self-determination. He remembered the argument itself, the trivial disagreement over some slight perceived wrong, yet the words that left his mouth were catastrophic. They had been sharp, unjustly aimed, and utterly devastating to the man he cared for most. In the instant after they flew across the small space, a terrible silence descended, heavier than any storm. That moment, the raw choice of tongue, had always seemed like the purest expression of free will, a sudden, unscripted eruption of his own being. He had blamed his actions entirely on his momentary volition, refusing to see any larger mechanism at play. The film reel of memory played back with unrelenting precision. It was not just the words themselves that tormented him, but the sickening realization that those words were perhaps, always, a necessary sequence. His rising anger, fueled by perceived slight and historical buildup of minor slights, each one-a-minute ripple in the pre-existing current, had been inevitable. The specific timing, the exact tone, the point at which his rational restraint had finally snapped. All elements seemed to fit into a perfect, unbreakable chain. He tried to pinpoint where he might have pulled back. Was it before the slight was perceived, or when the retort began forming on his tongue? He strained against the imagined causality, searching for the single point of genuine leverage, the place where necessity yielded to choice. But every path led him in circles. The preceding arguments, the way the light had hit certain surfaces, the accumulated exhaustion, all converged into that singular moment of volatile speech. It was as if he were observing a meticulous clockwork mechanism, realizing his emotional outburst was merely the final, predictable tick of countless prior causes. The sting was not in the memory of the hurt inflicted, but in the erosion of his own agency. If even an angry outburst, an action considered intensely personal and spontaneous, was simply the inevitable culmination of external forces and internal buildup, then what did that make him? Merely a complex arrangement of atoms responding to stimuli. A beautifully intricate puppet following strings he could not see. The grief was profound. It stripped away his intellectual certainty, leaving only the raw ache of lost selfhood. He had staked so much of his identity on the belief in the sovereign self, the self capable of truly defying fate. To lose that foundation felt like falling from a great height into a deep void of meaning. He sat by the quiet corner where Zeno often led him to meditate, watching the dust motes dance lazily in the afternoon sunbeams filtering through the canopy. The grand philosophical debates, which had once seemed so capable of providing an intellectual shield against chaos, now felt flimsy and inadequate. All the paradoxes, the chain reaction, the scripted marketplace, had only been preliminary sketches. This deeply personal memory provided the undeniable, emotional proof. He finally understood that true choice was not merely about doing something different. It was about accepting that what happened had to happen. His outburst was a necessary drama in the unfolding cosmic play. To fight the determination of his own passion was to struggle against the immutable laws of cause and effect, a battle already lost before he even raised his voice. This revelation brought not immediate peace, but a deep, melancholic resignation, the pang of realizing the magnitude of what lay outside his grasp. He began to feel the weight of everything that was unchangeable, the past, the motives of others, and even the ferocious trajectory of his own emotions when pushed too far. He breathed slowly, deliberately, forcing himself away from the consuming fire of how could I have chosen otherwise. Instead, he focused on the physical sensation of air entering and leaving his lungs. The breath itself was a neutral event, neither good nor bad, determined by biological necessity. And in that simple rhythm, he began to find the first fragile space of resistance. The focus shifted, inevitably, back to judgment. If the action, the words spoken, were unavoidable, then where lay the sanctuary? It could not be found in undoing the past moment, nor could it be found in controlling external events like other people's temperaments or thoughts. The only sovereignty left was within the assent given to experience. He remembered Zeno's quiet voice, pointing repeatedly back toward internal discipline. If fate dictated his anger, he still possessed the power, the ultimate, final veto, over how much weight and emotional meaning he assigned to that very anger when it had passed. It was a subtle shift, terrifying in its implication. Surrender everything external, accept all outcomes, and then fiercely guard the citadel of internal judgment. The sting remained, but slowly, beneath the pain, a nascent ember of profound, inescapable peace began to glow. The air by the river was cool and smelled of damp earth. Cassius sat on the worn stone bank, watching the current pull at a scatter of logs downstream. They floated heedlessly, bumping against unseen obstacles only to rejoin the steady flow. For days, he had struggled with this view, wrestling with the concept of fate. Was their drift random, or was it guided by forces far larger than the visible banks? He watched a small piece of driftwood catch upon a submerged root, pausing its journey for a breath, before being pulled free again into the relentless sweep. He thought of his own life, his own tumultuous spirit, and how often he had fought against what simply was. Every word spoken in anger, every hurried decision made in frustration, felt to him like a conscious act of will, a victory over inevitability. This river, he realized, seemed indifferent to such struggles. It carried everything, the debris of old struggles, the vibrant gifts of moments past, and the promise of unseen futures. Nothing stayed put, nothing was exempt from its passage. Zeno sat quietly beside him, not offering advice, merely observing. His silence spoke volumes more than any lecture could have. Cassius felt a deep weariness settle over him, a fatigue born not of physical labor, but of constant inner resistance. He was tired of trying to be the captain of his own ship in an ocean that demanded he become merely driftwood. He remembered the stinging clarity of realizing his outburst had been predetermined. He had been so focused on owning the sin of that choice that he had ignored the deep current that carried him toward it. Was genuine freedom even possible if every thought, every flicker of emotion, was simply the necessary unfolding of what came before? He picked up a smooth, water-worn pebble, turning it over and over in his palm. It felt solid, immutable, yet completely subject to the current that had shaped it over millennia, smoothed by the endless push and pull of time itself. The struggle was not against fate's existence. It was against his own refusal to accept its necessity. To fight the flow meant exhausting himself fighting reality itself. The concept began to shift in his mind, slowly, like a deep tide turning the sand beneath the stones. He realized that many of the moments he had labeled as choice were merely points of intersection, moments where preceding forces met and found only one viable path forward. The illusion was not that choice did not exist. It was simply that free will, in the way he understood it, was a beautiful but ultimately flawed construction. He looked at Zeno, seeking confirmation, but found only thoughtful eyes that suggested all answers were already within him. Zeno pointed toward the river's edge, where small eddies formed and dissipated quickly, briefly rearranging the scattered leaves before being subsumed back into the main flow of power. These eddies seemed to represent his moments of perceived control, small, vigorous efforts against the dominant current. The lesson was breathtakingly simple. Expenditure is resistance. To actively fight the inevitable path is to burn energy on a war that cannot be won. Accepting, instead, requires nothing more than noticing where one stands and realizing that acceptance itself is not an action, but a state of inner alignment with reality. The river did not judge the floating logs for their journey. It merely allowed them to follow. And in that allowing lay a profound wisdom. True freedom was not found in directing the course of the water, but in ceasing the exhausting battle against its inherent movement. By stopping the struggle, he would find an unexpected peace. If necessity is the law of the cosmos, then his only battlefield remains inside him. His judgment, his assent, that single interior citadel, remains untouched by the flow, untouched by the current's irresistible pull. This recognition was not a surrender. It was a supreme mastery. It was the knowledge that no matter how vast or complex the forces at play outside, he alone held the power to guide his own spirit's reaction to them. The river flowed, and his inner judgment remained steady, letting go of what cannot be controlled and finding freedom in that tranquil acceptance. The relentless flow of time had taught Cassius one profound lesson by the river's edge. Resistance is exhausting. He watched the logs drift downstream, unbidden and unstoppable, a visual sermon on necessity itself. To fight that current was to waste his own strength against an immense, indifferent power. But this morning, facing Zeno in the cool quiet of the courtyard, the challenge was not physical. It was purely intellectual. Zeno had laid out the components of a complex sequence of actions. He asked Cassius to predict the outcome if 3 people, the merchant, the scribe, and the guard, were to walk across the square. First, the merchant would stop to adjust his sandals. This required him to glance left, which caused him to bump into the waiting scribe. The scribe, startled, would drop a stack of papyri, and the sound would draw the attention of the passing guard. Predict that sequence. Then, if the scribe quickly picked up the papers while avoiding the guard's gaze, what would be the next predictable micro-adjustment? Zeno continued to layer on conditions, building an edifice of cascading causality so intricate it felt both real and entirely artificial. Cassius tried. He focused his incredible concentration, visualizing the initial impulse the merchants need for better sandals. Then he mapped the ripple, the necessary glance, the minor collision, the resulting scattering of objects, and the predictable response to that noise. With each layer Zeno added, Cassius found himself not predicting a free action, but tracing an inescapable path. His mind worked like a perfect machine following predetermined rules. There was no room for deviation. Every minute twitch, every hesitation, emerged logically from what came immediately before it. The concept of genuine novelty, of true spontaneity or unfettered will, began to fade under the weight of such pure predictability. The challenge of the perfect predictor game was designed not to test his memory, but his foundational belief in randomness itself. By demonstrating how every action is simply a necessary effect of preceding causes, Zeno slowly stripped away the comforting illusion that lay at the heart of Cassius's deepest struggle. If he could map this dance with such absolute certainty, if he knew that the merchant had to look left and the scribe had to drop the papyri because of the initial stop, then where, precisely, was the space for radical freedom? Where did choice lie when every variable was already accounted for by the chain reaction of cause and effect? Cassius found his thoughts growing heavy, sinking into the deep realization that determinism offered a devastating elegance. It wasn't merely a philosophical theory. It felt like an observable law of nature applied to human existence itself. He had spent so much time striving for absolute freedom of action, a grand, heroic I will choose moment, that he failed to account for the subtle mechanics by which those choices are made possible, or indeed, required. This realization was more profound than his loss of agency in his past emotional outburst. The outburst had been a singular act. This demonstration implied that his entire life, every smile, every pang of anger, every moment of contemplation, was simply the inevitable unfolding of countless prior causes and conditions. He felt himself shrinking, not because he lost power, but because he understood the sheer scope of cosmic necessity surrounding him. He began to stare past Zeno, finding his mind wandering back toward the central question. If everything is determined, what remains? If our actions are mere echoes of necessary cause and effect, then where does moral responsibility reside? How can we preach virtue if our adherence to it was always inevitable? This philosophical knot threatened to paralyze him. He could not even affirm what remained because his understanding of reality had been fundamentally shaken. The very foundation of human self-determination seemed built on an assumption of indeterminacy, an assumption now proven flimsy by the logic of prediction. We stand at a precipice of understanding. The weight of possibility, once exhilarating, now feels like an unbearable burden. We have traced the lines of cause and effect, seeing how every flicker of movement, every whispered word, is inextricably bound to what came before it. It is exhausting, this attempt to locate a singular point, the moment where pure free will can strike against the torrent of necessity. We feel as if we are perpetually pulling at an invisible thread, believing that our intention holds the power to sever a chain reaction built over millennia. Yet, the deeper Zeno pressed us into the paradox, the more resistant our innate belief in self-determination became. We wanted freedom to be dramatic. We craved the glorious exception, the sudden act of will that defies all prediction and necessity. But the truth, exposed by the steady stream of logic, is far quieter and perhaps more unnerving. True power lies not in changing the plot, but in mastering the breath of the present moment. Consider your breathing. It is the most reliable rhythm we possess. It requires no deliberation. It does not ask permission from the past or promise a change to the future. In this very instance, right now, you draw air into your lungs and release it. This simple, primal act is completely outside of our ability to command moment by moment. We can try to regulate it, to force it into a pattern we deem perfect, but even in that struggle, we are only reacting to the need for control. Look at this breath now. It arrives simply because you are here. It is an unfolding necessity, just as much as the next step of your journey down the river or the words spoken by the strangers in the market. To understand necessity through the breath is to accept its unforced rhythm. There is no grand, decisive choice required at this interval, only a continuous stream of simple existence. The challenge Zeno presented was not philosophical abstraction, it was physical reality. Focus on that inhalation and exhalation. When you analyze it, you begin to see that the breath itself obeys a certain law. The in must follow the out, and the out must follow the in. It follows nature's design. To fight its natural ebb and flow is merely to waste vital energy. We have spent so much effort trying to determine what we are doing freely. We focused on outward actions, running away from injustice, speaking truth against the crowd, or deciding which path to take at a crossroads. But the deepest realization compels us to turn inward, back to this elemental rhythm. The breath demands nothing of us except attention. It asks only that we simply observe its unfolding. This immediate moment, this perfect nexus of inhalation and exhalation, becomes our ultimate control point. We cannot determine the next gust of air, nor can we command the passing of time itself, but we possess a sovereignty over how we interpret this very breath. Is it labored? Is it shallow? Is it deep and rhythmic? Our internal judgment labels this physical reality. That labeling is where true self-mastery resides. We are trained to believe that freedom means the ability to choose differently than dictated by our circumstances. But perhaps freedom is simply the ability to assent to what is, without adding unnecessary suffering or resistance. The breath reminds us that acceptance is not a passive surrender. It is an active alignment with nature's inevitable rhythm. This understanding changes everything. If external events, the political chaos of the Agora, the emotional outburst of a friend, the inevitability of aging, are predetermined sequences, then our battleground cannot be the world around us. Our struggle must shrink until it fits within the confines of a single decision: how to judge this moment's necessity. The breath itself becomes a meditative anchor. When anxiety clutches at the edges of your consciousness, whispering doubts about fate or demanding impossible changes, you are taught to return immediately to the simple physical fact of air entering and leaving. This process is nothing more than disciplined observation. It is recognizing that your initial emotional surge, the panicked assumption that something should be different, is just another passing judgment, another dictated thought that requires no allegiance. This mastery over assent is what Zeno understood as profound freedom. The philosopher does not gain the power to stop the rain or dictate the passage of time, but they gain the impregnable fortress within their own mind. They learn to observe a difficult reality, a necessary hardship, and respond not with despair, nor with defiant struggle, but with reasoned acknowledgement. This is what it is. And in that clean, unburdened acceptance, we finally touch upon the quiet core of Stoic virtue. We are free not from necessity, but within it. The reflection was deceptive. Cassius stood before the still pool, the water's surface barely disturbed by the heat rising from the Athenian pavement. He thought he saw himself turning left, a clear decision etched into his posture. But as the image trembled slightly, showing glimpses of moments past and future, the reality dissolved. The path to the right seemed just as inevitable, guided by forces unseen. Was this freedom? Or was it merely an echo of what had always been necessary? He closed his eyes, forcing himself to look not at the paths, but at the self that stood between them. The pool offered no answers, only a perfect, unnerving symmetry, a reflection that whispered of absolute predetermination. If every glance, every twitch of the finger, was merely the necessitated outcome of prior existence, then where did choice reside? Was it an illusion woven by our limited consciousness, a comforting lie we tell ourselves to feel in control? This confrontation was more acute than any debate with Zeno. It demanded a personal reckoning. He recalled the sequence of events leading up to his outbursts, how easily emotion could flare, not from genuine freedom, but from an accumulation of preceding conditions and subtle biases. Even the desire to choose felt manufactured, a cascade effect built upon breath and thought. The philosophy had stripped away the comfortable myth of self-creation. He was not the architect of his own will, but rather, perhaps, a highly sophisticated clockwork mechanism reacting flawlessly to the spring tension of fate. To accept this meant relinquishing a vital part of his identity, the pride of being an autonomous agent. It felt like falling out of grace. He opened his eyes and stared into the ripple pattern on the water. He focused intently on a single leaf, watched it drift across the pool, never once questioning its trajectory. It simply was. The leaf embodied the principle he had grappled with for weeks. Necessity is not merely what happens, but how we meet what happens. The mind strained to find the loophole, the single point of divergence. But the more he searched, the wider and smoother the causal chain appeared. Every thought that sparked a conviction, every hesitation before moving forward, all these were predictable consequences. His inner life seemed just as scripted as his movements through the Agora. He finally understood that trying to prove free will by identifying a moment of spontaneous deviation was a fool's errand. Such an act would violate the very nature of causality itself. True power could not be found in altering external events because they were fixed. It had to reside somewhere untouched by time, untainted by cause and effect. The focus slowly shifted, drawn inward, down into the quiet core of his being. If he could not control what happened next, the actions of others, the capriciousness of the winds, or the fate of man's empires, then where was the citadel of true liberty? It was in assent. It was in the moment he decided whether to judge the external event as good or bad. The thing itself remained outside his control, yet his agreement with its value rested entirely within him. This realization was a profound shift, transforming the locus of power from the outward world back into the interior judgment. The pool's reflection seemed less critical now. It simply reflected an ongoing process. He realized that man's true freedom was not the absence of necessity, but the mastery of reaction to necessity. To live aligned with nature's law meant understanding that our function is not to change fate, but to maintain perfect harmony between what we desire and what must be. This quiet acceptance became his new compass point. He had ceased looking for a moment where he deviated from the script. Instead, he learned to embody the character written by virtue itself. The debate had shifted. It was no longer a conflict fought in the marketplace or by the flow of the river. The external world, with its unpredictable crowds and relentless currents of fate, now seemed to recede into a mere backdrop. Cassius found himself facing Zeno not across an expanse of open air, but across the quiet space between two opposing thoughts. The lesson had moved beyond necessity itself. It was no longer enough merely to accept that all actions were determined by cause and effect. The understanding of fate provided peace, yet a deeper question remained. If our deeds are scripted, where does true self-mastery reside? Zeno watched him, his expression as patient as the slow turning of the seasons. He waited for Cassius to find the center point of this vast philosophical equation. The silence stretched, demanding more than just intellectual agreement. It required a profound internal commitment. He began to speak not of what happens to us, but of what happens within us. If our actions are mere results, inevitable consequences stemming from preceding conditions, then where is the lever by which we might change ourselves? Where does responsibility truly begin? Zeno argued that while external events wash over us, touching and shaping everything we encounter, there exists a domain untouched by fate's direct command, our inner judgment, our ability to assent or dissent to what life presents. This was the core argument of virtue. This internal landscape became the new battlefield. It was not about resisting necessity. That fight had proven exhausting and futile. Instead, it was about choosing how we interpret necessity. To see a setback merely as an impediment versus interpreting it as a harsh injustice. The chasm separating these two judgments is the entire realm of moral freedom. The philosophy urged Cassius to perform an act of radical reorientation. He had spent weeks battling fate, trying to determine if he was truly free to choose or merely acting out an ancient script. Now, he realized that the point of conflict was not in his hands, but in his mind's acceptance. This subtle difference is monumental. Consider a man forced by circumstance to act harshly against another person. His body moves. His mouth speaks words of regret. He did not choose the action, for it sprang from a causal chain he could not break. But he can choose how much internal weight and condemnation he gives to that action. He can choose to judge the necessity as unavoidable tragedy, or he can judge it through the lens of self-reproach and moral failure. This selection, the assent given to an event, is where man retains sovereignty. It is not control over circumstance, it is control over judgment. This internal resistance became the ultimate definition of freedom for the Stoics. Virtue, therefore, was not a set of external accomplishments, but a disciplined state of mind that determined our response to inevitable reality. The struggle transformed from one of physical action into an act of intellectual and emotional discipline. Cassius began to examine his past moments through this new filter. He recalled the angry outburst described in Chapter 4, no longer feeling simply helpless. Instead, he noticed the layers of judgment underneath that anger, the prejudgment that the other person had wronged him, fueling the final regrettable word. He understood that while the event and the resulting emotional impulse were necessary consequences, the catastrophic interpretation attached to them was not. The necessity of external events demands only a disciplined inner response. This internal resistance is what Zeno termed self-mastery, the refusal to allow fate, or even painful memory, to dictate one's moral character. If life hands him suffering, a plague, a betrayal, a loss, he cannot change the happening, but he can choose whether to judge that suffering as bad, or merely as indifferent raw material for growth. This is where his unique freedom resides. It is a profound and quiet power. It whispers that true self-mastery means aligning one's judgments with nature's rational order, accepting the given reality without bitterness or false hope. The burden of maintaining this constant vigilance, the discipline to judge wisely at every moment, was immense. Yet it offered a durable solace. When confronted by external chaos, when the currents of fate seemed overwhelming and indifferent, he knew where his fort lay, within the fortress of his own judgment. The ultimate act of will was simply choosing wisdom over panic, acceptance over resistance, and reasoned assent over emotional outcry. This silent vigilance became the essence of what it meant to be truly free, even if freedom itself is merely a perfect form of internal discipline. We have traveled far with this question, tracing the boundaries between fate and will. We have seen how every breath, every stumble, and even every flicker of anger is but a necessary echo of what came before. The idea that we are truly masters of ourselves, that our actions spring from an uncaused spark of pure choice, has proven to be a beautiful, yet fragile illusion. Yet, acceptance feels cold. To yield entirely to necessity seems to drain the warmth from existence, suggesting that pain and joy, love and loss, are simply parts of an indifferent cosmic machinery, unavoidable and meaningless. If our suffering is preordained, what value remains in resisting it? What impetus drives us toward virtue if all paths were sealed before we even woke? It was to this dilemma that Cassius found himself. He stood facing the residue of his learning, a profound and quiet understanding of causality, paired with the deep human need for moral significance. The Stoics offered him not a conclusion, but an attitude, a framework for living within necessity. He walked through life now with a newly sharpened gaze. His journey had taught him that he could not change what was, but he was beginning to understand how to meet what was with dignity. He learned to view the world not as a collection of arbitrary moments, but as an unfolding drama played out by universal reason. Everything happened for a reason, though that reason might be too vast and complex for human comprehension to grasp fully. The lesson now moved beyond mere intellectual assent. It became profoundly empathetic. Cassius began to see necessity through the eyes of others. When he observed hardship, the shared grief over loss, the struggle against unjust circumstances, the quiet ache of everyday failure in another person's face, he no longer saw these struggles merely as inevitable forces acting upon them. He saw a mirror reflecting the universal condition. The Stoic concept suggests that since all events are determined by fate, then suffering itself must also be part of that necessary order. But this truth is not intended to become a philosophical shield for indifference. Instead, it compels a deep wellspring of understanding, an empathy that transcends judgment and mere pity. Empathy with necessity means recognizing the inherent tragedy in being human. We are beings capable of immense suffering, bound by physical law, yet possessing a divine spark of reason that demands meaning. When he saw two people struggling together through mutual loss, his internal conflict transformed again. He was not tempted to judge their grief as disproportionate or wrong. He accepted it simply as is. This acceptance did not minimize the pain, but rather framed it within the great tapestry of shared human existence. He began to recognize that our capacity for empathy, our ability to feel genuinely for another's struggle, is itself a rational function, woven into the fabric of nature. It is not an aberration or an exception to fate. It is part of the mechanism by which humanity achieves its highest form of connection and understanding. His meditations deepened. He realized that if his own painful moments were necessary outcomes, then the inevitable suffering of others was also dictated by a cosmic geometry. And since he could not change their circumstance, nor the causes of their pain, his only possible response was one of profound emotional resonance. To truly understand another person meant to accept the necessity of their reality, just as fully as accepting the necessity of his own. This necessitated abandoning any clinging notion of personal grievance or deserved justice. To plead for fairness in a world governed by universal law is to fight the current with limited strength. True freedom, he found, lay in aligning his internal state with the flow of what must be. This wasn't resignation. It was powerful acceptance, a recognition that meaning itself is built not by changing events, but by radically understanding our place within them. This radical empathy became his most defining characteristic. He stopped asking why bad things happen to people. Instead, he quietly started to observe the interconnected web of causes and effects that led them to where they were, and in observing that connection, that sheer necessity, he found a grounding peace. His understanding shifted from intellectual theory to lived spiritual practice. The universe was vast, governed by unceasing laws, and within those laws unfolded the beautiful, necessary pattern of human compassion. The morning air was cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of cypress wood and damp earth. For weeks, Cassius had wrestled with the profound weight of necessity. He had traced the intricate chains of cause and effect through every choice, from the smallest flutter of a leaf to the most dramatic declarations of love or betrayal. The question of his freedom had become an endless philosophical torture. Was he truly deciding now, in this quiet moment, or was the decision already sealed by millennia of nature's unfolding rhythm? He felt suspended between a painful certainty and utter confusion. Yet, as the sun climbed higher over the rooftops, casting long, forgiving shadows, something began to shift within him. The endless cycle of asking why him, why now, why must this happen, began to lose its grip. This questioning had been his cage, trapping him in a perpetual examination of external forces. But Zeno's wisdom, repeated like an immutable mantra, kept guiding him toward one singular point of focus. The struggle was not about the existence of fate itself, nor even whether free will truly operated as we imagined it. The profound shift lay in changing the question entirely. It was no longer the desperate plea for validation. Why me? To escape this painful understanding. No, what now? How must I live with this terrible knowledge that so much is outside my direct control? This realization required shedding the academic burden of defining freedom and embracing the lived reality of acceptance. He thought back to the moments of agonizing internal conflict, the rage he had felt years ago, the despair over lost opportunity, the intellectual agony in predicting human behavior. In each instance, his natural impulse had been to push against the inevitable tide, to curse the currents or to demand a different outcome. This resistance had only exhausted him and clouded his judgment. He saw that all this intense focus on what had happened, and what might have been prevented, was merely an attempt to exert control over the uncontrollable expanse of time itself. Time, he now understood, does not reward defiance, it rewards alignment. The past could never be reclaimed or altered. It was set by necessity. But the present moment, this single breath drawing into his lungs, remained a point of pure, terrifying possibility. Not the freedom to change events, but the absolute sovereignty over how he judged those events. That became the core pillar of his new understanding. His journey had moved from external resistance to internal posture. He was no longer looking backward at the injustice or the limitation. He was looking forward, ready to inhabit this breath with disciplined intention. The philosophical scaffolding that had supported his identity, the very premise that defining freedom was possible, was quietly dismantled. What remained was pure action, guided not by wish fulfillment or desperate assertion, but by rationality and virtue. He began to walk away from the lingering shadow of existential questioning, turning his attention entirely toward the immediate task of being a thoughtful, moral human in this specific moment. It was a surrender of intellectual argument for the sake of profound, lived peace. The weight lifted, replaced by a quiet clarity that felt more potent than any victory. This radical acceptance demanded nothing less than total participation in the flow of life. He began to see the entire tapestry of existence not as a set of painful paradoxes to solve, but as a beautiful, overwhelming design, a necessity to be lived fully and rationally. The struggle with if was over, only the discipline of how remained. This meant acknowledging fate's encompassing laws while simultaneously asserting the unwavering commitment to inner goodness in every single action. It meant understanding that true power resided not in changing the script, but in perfecting the performance within the established role. He shed the historian's critical gaze and adopted the living philosopher's heart. His purpose shifted from proving a theory to embodying a life, from debating causality at a riverbank to simply breathing, thoughtfully, with wisdom guiding every step. The uncertainty of existence did not bring him panic, but rather an exquisite sense of preparation. He realized that if everything was predetermined, then the highest virtue became perfect assent, the ability to greet necessity not with resignation, but with grace and active participation. This was a freedom far greater than any defiance. It was the supreme act of self-mastery, choosing your judgment in every moment offered by fate. And so, Cassius left the burden of metaphysical questions behind him. His life was no longer a puzzle to be solved. It was simply a way to be lived, fully and rationally, exactly as it unfolds around him. He walked forward, not knowing what awaited him, but supremely prepared for whatever necessity might bring. This new understanding marked his true beginning. The student Cassius arrived at the threshold of action, not burdened by the false comfort of choice, but guided instead by a quiet certainty. All the intellectual battles waged in the Agora, the profound losses felt by the river's edge, had led him here, to the difficult necessity of doing what must be done. He approached the person in need, perhaps a friend consumed by fresh grief, perhaps a weary stranger burdened by injustice. The situation demanded an action, yet Cassius no longer understood that this action sprang from a single point of arbitrary decision. He did not decide to comfort them. Rather, the virtuous nature he had cultivated simply compelled it. The philosophy now contained within him was less about understanding fate's mechanism and more about embodying its principles. It was a quiet surrender of ego-driven choice. When faced with sorrow, his instinct was no longer to debate whether the grief was deserved or unjust, for such judgments were merely internal noise attached to external necessity. Instead, he found himself moving with a disciplined calm. This compassion was not an optional gesture. It was simply the natural outflow of accepting that suffering, too, is part of the universal design. He learned that true action does not require the struggle of choice. Choice implies alternative paths, and Cassius now saw all perceived alternatives as merely different steps along a single, necessary trajectory. If he offered words of solace, those specific words were dictated by the confluence of his trained character, the listener's need, and the unalterable flow of time itself. His tenderness was inevitable, just as the sunrise is inevitable after the darkest night. This understanding brought with it a profound peace that surpassed mere acceptance. Acceptance had been intellectual, a philosophical realization that fate governs all things. This new state was practical, an emotional alignment. It meant acting without internal resistance or attachment to outcome. He gave his support not hoping for thanks, nor expecting the suffering person to feel better immediately. He acted solely because the principles of virtue demanded it at that precise moment. The weight of this realization shifted his entire relationship with effort. Before, he had felt compelled to will good things into existence, to conquer injustice through personal will, or to choose words perfectly enough to restore happiness. Now, he understood that true goodness was found in the impeccable execution of character. The action itself became evidence of alignment. If the moment called for quiet listening, then his entire being settled into that posture. If it demanded firm correction, then his voice carried with measured authority. It was disciplined being, not impulsive doing. The journey from why me to what now had transformed him from a reactive philosopher grappling with past mistakes into an agent of immediate moral truth. His actions were therefore fully responsible, yet paradoxically free. This freedom resided entirely in the quality of his internal readiness, the unwavering commitment to virtue regardless of what external circumstances might throw at him. He could not choose the tragedy unfolding around him, but he chose how deeply and how genuinely he would respond to it. This is the ultimate liberation, recognizing that the self is not defined by the choices one makes, for those are necessary outcomes, but by the manner in which one consents to necessity. By aligning his inner judgment, his assent to the unchangeable rhythms of nature and fate, he found a quiet power far more profound than any perceived free will could grant him. He walked through life as an instrument tuned perfectly to the cosmic harmony. Each breath, each glance, and every outstretched hand moving with the inevitable grace of duty fulfilled. The journey of thought had led Cassius to a quiet clearing, a place where the relentless noise of argument could finally subside. He stood there, emptied of debate and certainty, facing the simple truth presented by Zeno's persistent paradoxes, that perhaps the drama of his life was already written. The notion of absolute free will, the deeply cherished belief in self-authorship, felt fragile here, like a scroll exposed to wind and time. He had spent so long fighting against necessity, believing every slight decision marked a unique turning point authored by his own desperate will. Yet, staring out at the slow, predictable movement of the world, a cloud passing, a distant bird following an invisible route, he began to feel not merely resignation, but profound clarity. He understood now that arguing against fate was like wrestling the tide. It was exhausting, futile, and only led to frustration. The external events, the arguments that stung, the losses that saddened, the people who wronged him, were necessary outflows of causality. They simply happened, following the inescapable path laid down by preceding causes. To dwell on the unfairness of them, or to yearn for a past moment where he could have chosen differently, was merely to suffer unnecessary internal struggle. The weight shifted from the outside world entirely. If his actions were determined by what came before, then where did genuine power reside? Cassius closed his eyes, taking a slow breath that felt different from any previous inhalation of doubt or resistance. He began searching inward, not for a miraculous exception to fate, but for the sliver of untouched ground within himself. He realized that necessity dictated everything outside his own inner citadel. The words spoke by others, the weather, the political tides, the memory itself. These were all flows he could observe but not command. But what remained was something utterly separate, his judgment, his assent, the way he chose to interpret an event once it occurred. This understanding formed the core of freedom. It meant accepting that while the script might be written, the actor always holds the authority over their emotional response to the lines they are forced to speak. A harsh word spoken by a friend was merely a necessary external event. The choice, the truly free act, was whether or not he would judge that word as hurtful, unforgivable, or catastrophic. Zeno had taught him that freedom was not doing what he wanted, but rather willing to accept what is. It required a radical shift in focus, from the uncontrollable narrative of his life to the absolute control over his internal landscape. This was the realization that gave his struggle a final meaning. It was not about changing fate at all, but about mastering himself within it. He understood that determinism did not lead to apathy or paralysis. Rather, it led to profound dignity. By shedding the desperate illusion of ultimate control over external outcomes, he gained perfect mastery over his only genuine domain, the quality and rational nature of his ascent. His true power lay in cultivating virtue, not as an action to be forced, but as a steady, deliberate rhythm of judgment that harmonized with necessity. It was internal resistance, yes, but not resistance against fate itself. Rather, it was the disciplined refusal to let external chaos breach the gates of his inner peace. This acceptance, this alignment with nature's rational law, was the deepest, most lasting freedom imaginable. The script remained undeniable and immense, yet Cassius finally felt unbound. He no longer saw himself as a victim of circumstances or a prisoner of fate's machinations. Instead, he perceived himself as a conscious participant in a grand cosmic play, a role he could fulfill with grace, wisdom, and profound dignity. The greatest freedom was not the ability to alter the plot, but the internal power to remain unshaken by it. The weight of the argument had settled upon Cassius. He stood in a space that once felt vast and terrifyingly empty, yet now it held a profound sense of quietude. The frantic energy of his earlier philosophical battles, the desperation to prove control through sheer will, had finally dissipated like morning mist. He did not stand there because fate commanded him to, nor was he standing there merely by chance. Every muscle movement, every thoughtful glance, they were part of the necessary sequence that brought him to this precise moment. Yet, in accepting that necessity, something extraordinary occurred. A deep and enduring peace settled over his spirit. The concept of freedom had undergone a radical transformation. He had spent years demanding an exception to fate's unwavering law, a loophole where free will could declare itself exempt from cause and effect. He sought proof that he was the architect of his own beginning, unbound by the river's eternal current. But every path led back to necessity. He remembered the frantic struggle against the belief in absolute chance, a belief as illusory as wishing away grief. It was tempting, perhaps, to declare himself an exception, but Zeno had shown him that such defiance was only intellectual rebellion, not genuine power. The true source of human dignity lay elsewhere, within the judgment itself. A new kind of freedom began to dawn for him. This freedom was not the ability to change the external world, nor was it the power to alter the actions of others or prevent suffering from striking his door. Such things remained firmly outside the sphere of human control, governed by the natural order and necessity. Instead, true liberty resided in the faculty of assent, the power over one's internal agreement with reality. It is the quiet, sovereign decision on how to interpret what has happened, or what is happening, at this very moment. He realized that if his body was a river log carried by an unseen current, his mind remained the navigator of that log. The river itself belonged to fate. The way he viewed the flow, with panic or with calm acceptance, that belonged only to him. The lesson was not one of resignation, but of mastery. Acceptance, in this context, is not a passive surrender. It is an active philosophical discipline. It requires deep insight into the nature of reality and the courage to align oneself fully with what must be. To argue against necessity is exhausting. To embrace it fully is profoundly liberating. The memories flashed back, the stinging words spoken in anger, the paths felt chosen in a reflective pool, the frustrating arguments waged through the busy Agora. In each instance, he had been attempting to exert will over something determined, like trying to hold back a vast ocean with bare hands. The effort was always futile, leaving him merely exhausted and agitated. But now, the exhaustion had given way to clarity. He saw that his choices were not spontaneous bursts of unpredictable will, but rather necessary responses flowing from his character, his settled inner disposition. If he judged necessity unjustly, his reaction would be regrettable. If he judged it with reasoned virtue, his response became inevitable peace. This was the deepest form of power, to know what is outside your control, and yet choosing how you will relate to it anyway. To allow fate its course while fiercely guarding the sanctity of one's inner judgment. This non-attachment did not breed indifference. Rather, it fostered a deep, robust capacity for engaged living. He walked forward, no longer burdened by the question of why, the desperate seeking of an origin point or justification. The questions of the past were irrelevant, merely fixed points on the river's endless path. His focus narrowed entirely to the now, to this single breath taken in this moment. This breath was necessary. His acceptance of it was his own sovereign act. The burden of trying to force free will into a deterministic universe had finally lifted. He understood that profound freedom is not an exception to nature's design, but rather a perfect alignment with it. It means acting virtuously and rationally within the unfolding narrative, recognizing that virtue itself is the only choice truly under human dominion. He did not merely exist. He embodied rational acceptance. He was part of the greater current, moving gracefully because he understood its rhythm, embracing both its inevitability and his own enduring power to judge it well. This realization transformed him from a struggling student into one who lived in profound philosophical liberty, unbound by fate, yet fully capable of choosing the quality of his soul. The journey to understanding freedom had led Cassius far from the comforts of certainty. He no longer sought an exception to fate, nor did he try to defy the relentless currents of existence. The frantic philosophical debates had settled into a quiet contemplation. He finally grasped that attempting to locate free will as a break in the chain was fundamentally misguided. The concept of self-mastery shifted entirely. It was not about doing something different. It was about agreeing with what is already happening. It was about aligning his inner mind, his deepest convictions, with the universal rhythm of nature itself. Life, Cassius realized, unfolded like a magnificent tapestry woven by an invisible hand. Every thread, every joy, every sorrow, every sudden turn of fortune was necessary for the pattern to reveal its whole beauty. To struggle against one color was only to exhaust himself and obscure the masterpiece. Acceptance, therefore, became not a passive surrender, but an active discipline. He walked now with a serene purpose that surprised those who had known his turbulent mind. He moved through the streets of Athens as if he belonged entirely to them, yet simultaneously felt apart from their drama, observing it with calm wisdom. He saw others reacting with passion, arguing over minor perceived injustices, or rushing toward uncertain goals. These reactions appeared meaningless, like sparks flying in an endless storm. Instead, his focus was drawn inward. He observed the steady rhythm of his own breath becoming a reliable anchor. In the deep breaths, he found not merely control but perfect understanding. The breath simply flowed, in and out, unasked for and undeniable. And within that simple, necessary act lay the key to all profound freedom. Cassius understood that true power resided precisely where choice seemed non-existent. When external events, the pronouncements of others, the capriciousness of fortune, even deep personal loss, were merely the inevitable consequence of prior causes, his sole remaining domain became his assent. This was the internal space, the judgment he applied to everything that happened. He learned to greet difficulty not as an assault on his will, but as a necessary friction required for growth. A setback was not a punishment, nor was it an anomaly. It was simply what had to happen next in the unfolding drama of life. This shift allowed him to shed any residue of victimhood or resentment. If every event is necessary and rational within the cosmic structure, then resistance itself becomes irrational. The way he moved became fluid, effortless, mirroring the natural flow of a river current. He was no longer fighting fate, he was riding it. When a friendship dissolved, he did not mourn the injustice, but acknowledged the necessity of their paths diverging. When faced with intellectual opposition, he accepted the flawed argument as part of human discourse, offering measured reply rather than passionate defense. His emotional life became disciplined and steady, held in place by this profound philosophical equilibrium. He understood that living according to nature's design was not a return to simplicity. It was an elevated complexity, a mastery achieved through seeing the world without requiring things to be different than they are. He embraced universal law, recognizing that humanity's finest impulse was its shared vulnerability and necessity for community. This empathy, rooted in acceptance of suffering as inevitable, was the highest form of wisdom. The final freedom, he concluded, was not a magical ability to change outcome, but the profound internal capacity to say yes. Yes to what is happening, yes to human fallibility, and yes to the unstoppable, beautiful necessity of existence itself. He lived now in that state, serene, purposeful, moving with the effortless grace of something perfectly aligned with its environment, truly embodying the philosophy